Gastronaut contains strong language. Viewer discretion is advised. Here we go then. I'm Oscar Yasui, formerly a professional food critic for the website Palladium, itself a subsidiary of Neptune Informations. Some of my listeners might be familiar with my body of work online if you're local, or through the wormways of the buffer if you're out past the rails. If you are not, then know that I wrote the articles The Lion of Cloudberry back in 22 and The Void Table in 25, both of which were winners of the Quartz Rail Award for Culinary Journalistic Excellence. I've also written a few books of middling quality. I won't mention their titles here. Now I'm doing a podcast, which I'll have a name for before I post this to the buffer, I believe. I'm not really a food critic, not anymore. I don't consider myself one. I think very soon it won't be a position I will be able to reliably find work at. Even if I ride the rails out of the Sol system, I can't really outrun a reputation. Why am I doing this? I'm doing this because when you're a food critic, not necessarily a good one, just one with a face or a voice people can relate to, you get invited to a lot of parties. People assume that you know where the best food is, even if they invite you off-planet for your opinion. I once attended a party aboard a high-speed aircraft that served a new dish made special for every nation it passed over. What was that party even about? Physically outrunning the new year? A race between yachts of the sky? Was it a drug smuggling operation? Another party was hosted in orbit above Europa, an experimental sushi feast that took advantage of microgravity. I believe the event was called Flying Fish. Yeah, it was Flying Fish. Not 15 minutes into the event, the critic panel, myself included, stampeded for the infirmary. Mentaiko, a kind of delicious spiced fish roe, and open eyes. Mentaiko, microgravity, and open eyes don't exactly mix. We food critics, especially those with a weekly click quota, have a troubling tendency to close our eyes as we eat. We open our senses to the flavor or mediocrity of a dish instead of taking a look around us. I quit my last job for a few reasons. The hours and constant travel, for example, were pretty shit. I also made the mistake of opening my eyes as I ate. I probably should have opened my eyes 6 years ago, when I experienced the third worst food poisoning of my entire life. I had won the Quartzy for the Lion of Cloudberry and was returning from a city I still call Fremont when the runway was snowed out. I did what any self-respecting adult does when plans change, and destroyed myself with $2 shots the airport sold for $8.50 a thimbleful. And in comes this baritone rumble at my left. Yasui, Oscar Yasui, Duke of New Caledonia, Mars, stuffed into a silk shirt and weighed down with so much precious metal, if he found a pawn shop, he could have bought the airport under our feet. That night, he insisted I accompany him to his vacation estate, claiming he had concocted a carpaccio that would impress even my satin sheet of a palate. Listeners, that is not an embellishment. He really did say that. The carpaccio we ate that night was sliced to near translucency, topped with pungent sweet white truffles that contrasted beautifully with the delicate, savory flavor of the meat. It was, by all accounts, a very impressive effort, only undermined by the Duke's choice to store his fantastically expensive ingredients at room temperature. The following day, I missed my flight again. My satin sheet palate exposed my meal a second time with a new twist of acid sourness. My entire intestinal tract ravaged by a salmonella infection. But that evening planted a seed in my mind about where ingredients come from. An ingredient being improperly refrigerated was one thing, but I did wonder where the Duke managed to acquire Italian white truffles from. There had to be a story there. That cultivar had been extinct for almost a decade. Where does food come from? This question, it's not unique within the broad sphere of food writing. 100 years ago, mark Arax's kingdom from dust. Trace the pistachio and the almond from tree to weathered hand to cheerful bag. Over 200 years ago, Upton Sinclair wrote of the quick butchering of pigs and the slow exsanguination of the immigrant worker. Today, any vlogger can grab a camera and a rail ticket and chase the origin of a dish out to the stars. Or at least Jupiter, if you're a college student. Tens of millions of viewers tune in monthly or weekly to learn that cookies are indeed still produced by the billion in factory complexes. Factory complexes that invest great effort in expanding profit margins wherever possible. What I'm doing here, it's not new, but I had to learn it anyway. The Duke of New Caledonia ruined carpaccio for me. The whole dish became something disgusting and inedible for me and me only. I'd eaten it before, but it didn't matter anymore. Carpaccio didn't have a place in my heart anymore. For years, I spoke and wrote and joked about the experience with colleagues, but it wasn't more than a piece of goofy, humanizing trivia. My readers loved anecdotes about waiters rushing to pull carpaccio off the menu when I arrived. Our tastes, they change as we grow older. For some, it comes quietly and suddenly. The meal they've ordered every Friday for 30 years just doesn't taste right. For others, it can be an unexpected second coming of age. The first tender bite of sashimi during a road trip, or the cold, squid-ink pasta served the bleary night after a difficult wedding. Which brings us back to parties. When I turned 31 a few years ago, I was sent to review a tapas place called Glass in the Bay City of Pobricaccio. The food was good, if pugnaciously trendy. Flaky amaranth flour empanadas, wrapped around a filling of Martian olives, spiced with sun-dried cantor seed and wave bud. The peppery flavor of the dough counterbalanced the salt of the olives, while the cantor seeds and wave bud lent a floral, tropical finish. The club's atmosphere, however, was oppressive, a retina-blasting bouquet of laser light, prismed through a sea of mirrors. The place was overcrowded, the AC failing to fight the heat and humidity of 100 gyrating bodies. As I sat, hunched over my tablet, my back assaulted by shoulders and elbows surging from the overflowing dance floor, my name came howling through that awful smoky air. A visitor followed shortly afterwards, face consumed by a practiced smile. His name was Mr. Ungerson. He wore a suit and a very pleasant shade of blue, and he was loudly and instantly a psychopath. We got to talking about our jobs. He was a media consultant on holiday, our taste in food. He did not care for the ammonium chloride licorice salmiak, and he declared that he would save our asses from this laser hell and get some authentic local cuisine. Authentic. We'll talk about that more later. He asked me if I would wait for his chauffeur to return from the bathroom. The word chauffeur struck me as terribly antiquated. I've seen some models for sale these days that don't even include steering wheels, opting instead to replace the control surfaces with touchscreens or entertainment systems. I was so absorbed by this train of thought that I just agreed to go with him, ignoring years of education about the danger of moving to a secondary location. Mr. Ogata was the name of the chauffeur, a tall and well-built man with almond eyes and a face of interlocking silver plates. I think the best way to describe Mr. Ogata is, weeks after this encounter, I eventually managed to look up Mr. Ungerson's first name in the buffer. It's Bradley, if anyone was curious. Please do not get in touch with him. Really. My searches for Mr. Ogata, on the other hand, did not yield a first name, or for that matter, any person at all. He was, or is, a man of cultivated impermanence in an age of total information continuity. The laser light of Glass shone off Ogata's features like technicolor constellations. Already 3 drinks into my evening at Glass, I asked Mr. Ogata if he had cut himself shaving. I was drunk and curious about his extensive body augmentation. Mr. Ogata, assuredly, practiced with navigating conversations with idiots, regarded me like a primordial thing in amber. The air outside the club was warm, scented with rubber, plastic, and salt blown in from the bay. Ogata sat beside us as Ungerson's sports coupe carried us to our destination, the cityscape lurching as we rose into the air, then melting into a smear of stone and light as we accelerated away. Mr. Ungerson knew of a place I had never heard of through Palladium or my own research. He claimed I'd never eat a place quite like it again. I flatly told him that such a thing was not possible. And besides, if a recipe could be created once, why couldn't it be replicated by another talented chef? For his part, he humored my illustrative defenses with a smile that must have cost more than my major. Mr. Ungerson confided in me a disappointment with the culinary scene of the city of Pobricuccio. He explained a fatigue he was experiencing with the dishes, and for some time I kept pace with his disappointment. His wealth and connections kept him free of any meal beneath 4 stars. I mentioned some of the city's greats, and he agreed with affable limpness. Maria's Cathedral was good, of course. Talcum Row had the best fish. Yes, he heard about their proximity to the dockyards. Yes, he knew that their secret recipe was a sour twist on the classic cream sauce. Mr. Ogata did not participate in our discussion. His focus freed by the air shuttle's autopilot, he merely observed our surroundings as we traveled, with special attention directed towards windows, alleyways, and rooftops. I recognized then the purpose of his augmentations, of his trained disinterest in conversation, the scarring on his knuckles. The cabin of the aero shuttle grew quite cramped just then. No space is large enough when among a man educated in the art of killing. With the gentle weightlessness afforded by top-of-the-line aero shuttle stabilizers, our small dinner party descended, landing in an alleyway that seemed ill-suited to the luxury of our transport. The doors slid back, then scissored upwards, dappling Mr. Ungerson's jaw with the brash light of small commerce. I moved to my companion to speak, to pry for information, but my answer came on the wind. Street food. A congregation of dozens of vendors warred for the attention of passerby. The smoky savor of grilling meat grappled with the salty tones of a roiling pot of tofu and broth. My glasses blinded me, steamed opaque by 100 spiced cookpots. The lights above us shone down into the puddles of yesterday's storms, and the world was an encompassing barrage of neon. Conversation was exchanged almost as quickly as food. What sports team to bet on? When the police might scatter the stalls? Which babysitter could be trusted for a 3-day weekend? Always there was food. Not on plates delivered by waiters, but sizzling on flat tops, pouring from ladles, turned by chopsticks on griddles, sent airborne by a 6'4" woman with an eye patch and an iron wok. I filled my lungs with the place, but could not ignore the eyes that Mr. Ungerson's aero shuttle had drawn, regardless of the shelter the cramped alley afforded. I realized then, with such perfect certainty, that Mr. Ungerson was giving me the dip and dazzle. Let me explain this. Street food is cuisine. Great food does not achieve greatness because of its stars. The stars are a celebration of its greatness. I had done this song and dance many times before. The mock revelation, the well-trodden path presented as virgin territory. Food writer Felicia Quayle referred to this trick as the dip and dazzle. Basically, taking meals that are maligned for being normal, working-class food, and strategically rediscovering them. It's a way to pretend at worldliness for a day. The assertion that a billionaire comfortable with $300 a plate meals can also find joy in a $3 corn dog. The dip and dazzle, she noted, was most effective within circles of the wealthy, where there was little risk that a mark would note that a host's hidden gem was, in fact, the place they already ate at 5 days a week for lunch. I wasn't a local, true, but the dip and dazzle has achieved such a mimetic status within food writing that I found my perspective on Mr. Ungerson changed in an instant. As we wound our way towards the market, past drunken businessmen arguing over condiments and disaffected construction workers smoking wordlessly, I found my previous interest waning. Mr. Ungerson's serpent-like qualities grew flimsy. It was easy to be apprehensive of a viper, but a snakeskin boot with an attitude was laughable.
We passed a hamburger stall, and I struggled to contain myself. Would he show me the hidden culinary powerhouse that was shoestring French fries? Would he lament that no seared steak could ever match that first juicy bite of a charbroiled hamburger? We approached a curtained doorway adorned with a hunting white stork, great legs towering over powder blue surf, and I hardened my heart for good food with a souring side of condescension.
The inside of the stall was warmly lit, smelling of tobacco smoke and hoisin sauce, rich and encompassing. The countertop ahead of us was as crowded as the stall's interior was, packed with great iron pots that stood like giants among crenellations of used cookware. 3 staff held court over a whirling dance of customers. A young woman with dark hair took orders. An older man with a tattoo of the Virgin Mary on his neck scrubbed dishes at a prodigious rate. Leading them all was a wiry older woman, a dimpled birthmark on her cheek, gray hair swaddled in a do-rag. It swam with little prints of koi fish, blazing the same hot orange as the stove fires. Mr. Ogata secured us seating through the use of almost imperceptible social violence. The rest of us sat, Mr. Ungerson exhaling and patting his belly as he did so. "It's all good, Oscar, all good. You can't go wrong with the entire menu. I'd never order for you, but if you had to try one dish first..." He let the sentence trail off. Mr. Ogata removed a sinuous cod-neck bottle from the counter cooler, its cherry-red contents contrasting the silvered grooves of his hand. The menu was small, a front with no back. No need for a beverage menu while the prices were scrawled on paper signage near the cooler. I exhaled, feeling my spine uncoil a little. To borrow the macabre bombast of the once food critic Daniel Aurora, a great menu is a small menu. A hammer leaves you breathless, but a scalpel sticks with you as you walk out. Aurora was an alarming individual, but his observations were rarely incorrect. My finger traced a brief journey down the laminated page, detouring around a sticky patch of sauce before I settled on a hearty bowl of beef pho, pot stickers, and a glass of frozen honeydew pearl tea. Mr. Ogata never touched the menu, preferring to nurse his soft drink, half present, half lost within the digital sphere that scattered lightning across the interior of his skull. Mr. Ungerson scanned his eyes up and down the page, occasionally glancing at the other patrons to see what they had ordered. His final selection was a fish pho bowl, a side of herb greens, and a water. I asked Mr. Ungerson why he was looking at other patrons if he had already been there. He laughed lightly and leaned towards me with conspiratorial glee, a hand cupped to his mouth as if to hide his words from onlookers. "Oscar, I totally know what to order. Everyone here knows their exact order. I'm not doing anything weird. I'm just trying to suss out what people aren't ordering. Call it taking the path less traveled. Trailblazing." I asked how you could trailblaze a menu so many other people had held in their hands, ordered from. He told me he'd break the word down some other time, then made some small talk about the news. We talked about finance. We talked about Lestrade. I made a joke about the market price of seeds, and Mr. Ungerson shrugged his shoulders, mouth twisted into a humoring smile. The death toll at Lestrade had reached 40,000 that evening. I don't feel any particular pride in that joke that I made. The dark-haired young woman used her sharp elbows and narrow hips to push back the crowd in the tent, battling it like a far-reaches colonial surveyor might battle undergrowth. She took our order candidly, without the genuflection of service, all the while working 2 sticks of blue gum furiously between her jaws. Then she turned, her ponytail whirling behind her like a flail, and vanished into the crowd. The food arrived in great bowls adorned with a line of marching yellow ducklings, the kind one might pass in a corner store beside boxes of candy and racks of hair scrunchies. Steam, fragrant with sharp herbs and tender cooked beef, rolled from the bowl's mouth like a great exhalation on a winter's night. The young, dark-haired woman set the tray before Mr. Ungerson and I, shouting over her shoulder at the older woman behind the counter. They were out of napkins, apparently. Glass felt a lifetime's distance from this place, but its food sat with presence within my gut. The bowl was more expansive than the menu appeared to claim. A great heap of pink-hearted beef rested amidst a golden broth, swimming with oil and spices. Spring green and bean sprouts peeked shyly among fat noodles. I tasted the broth with some apprehension, lifting the bowl to my lips, letting the flavor wash over me. Citrus, sweetness, savory notes, dancing in and out of focus on the tongue, before a rising capsaicin heat scattered them. Another forkful gave me a tender cut of beef, its succulent texture paired perfectly with the tender crispness of bean sprouts. The flavors only bolstered by my disappointment with my previous meal. Across from me, Ungerson appeared to be in the throes of culinary ecstasy, his susurrations and gratitude bursting through his manicured personality. "This is spectacular," I remember telling him. "Singular," Ungerson corrected, twirling a bean sprout around his chopsticks. "Masterful." I couldn't disagree. As the meal progressed, the angle of our bowls became increasingly acute, the pho thinning from a banquet to a broth, our appetites melting away with warmth of temperature, warmth of spice. Mr. Ogata, to my surprise, ordered a small plate of soft white dumplings about halfway through the meal. When I tried to make conversation with him, the coldness of his expression stilled me. "Hi. This is a few days after recording. I was going through the editing here, and I really found myself hung up on this little throwaway sentence. I was going to cut the part about calling Ogata's expression cold, because of the obvious issues it has with depicting a member of the cybernetic community. I chose to leave it in, not because I feel vindicated in describing him that way, but instead to draw attention to just how easy it is to do this to someone, to dehumanize them purely through diction. As you listen to the rest of this podcast, you'll find that Mr. Ogata and I did not have a good relationship, even in passing. But you can't just call an augmented individual cold or calculating. Aside over. Back to the podcast. The three of us were left with the sound of clinking bowls, polite slurping, that fundamental satisfaction that follows good goddamn food. I found myself looking behind the stall's counter, searching for the chef, mind in full critic mode. My article about glass struck me as childish, irrelevant. A sarcastic literary two-step, bemoaning how poor lighting ruined good food. I didn't care that my deadline to Palladium was fast approaching. I'd work myself into a migraine if it meant that I could put this alley establishment on the wider culinary map. I stood from the table, peering into the crowd, trying to catch a glimpse of the older woman as she stirred a great pot. I carried a Chorus 12S, light blue paneling with ebony trim, bought for me as a celebration gift when I published The Lion of Cloudberry. It emerged from the pocket of my slacks, held loosely in my grip, its directional microphone already paring away the audio of the surrounding crowd. I stopped when I realized I had caught my hand on something, or that someone had caught me. Mr. Ogata towered beside me, his cybernetic hand fully enclosing mine, pinning my digits against my gifted Chorus 12S. I took another step, my body went no further. Mr. Ogata slowly shook his head, the orange flames of the kitchen mirrored in his eyes. In one motion, he stepped forward, clapped his opposite hand on my shoulder, and turned me away from the counter, carrying me out through the cloth with a drawing of a hunting white stork. He was not rough with me, but I protested all the same. He stated, simply, "Be calm, Mr. Yasui. Mr. Ungerson will have an explanation for you, if he feels an explanation is necessary." And indeed, Mr. Ungerson soon followed us out. He smiled, his face snapping perfectly into the shape required to communicate sheepishness, helplessness. I was not being manhandled by his personal bodyguard, his face seemed to say. And if I was, what could he possibly do about it? He tilted his head, just barely, in the direction of a nearby alleyway, and we were off, the wet trash beneath our feet sounding of reeds and muck. Mr. Ungerson lifted his feet high, putting his best effort towards keeping the soles of his Silas Komodos clear of the debris. Even so, I heard him softly curse, pausing to grind the peel of a mango off his shoe. and leaving a greasy streak against the concrete. I wondered, bleakly, what would I leave behind in this alley if I was to be crushed? My Chorus 12S, recording the sounds of passerby, a bent frame of my glasses. Mr. Ungerson gestured to Mr. Ogata, and I was released, though he kept an eye on my person and any passerby. Mr. Ungerson approached and dusted off my somewhat indented shoulder. "You're okay, buddy. You'll be fine," he said. "Mr. Hydraulic Hands didn't rough you up any, just bruised the fabric of your jacket." I asked why they had pulled me out of the stall. "Because," he answered, "I mean, come on. You're a dangerous guy, Oscar." I couldn't fathom how he could consider me dangerous. I just stammered at him. He rolled his eyes. "Look, Oscar, they have great pho. Saved on a rail. Their entire menu is fantastic. See, when a place has an itty-bitty menu like that, it is always good." I couldn't stop myself just giving him a look of raw, fatigued exasperation. To my fortune, I think he mistook my look for further confusion. He continued, "Oscar, it isn't about how good the food tastes. It's great, sublime even, but it isn't everything. You didn't even catch the name of that little stall." At the time, he was completely correct. The truth was that, despite my mental defense of street food as a culinary institution, I would have never entered that stall on my own. I would never have come to this part of the city. Even after having eaten there, I still didn't know the name of the restaurant that I ordered that pho at. Looking back, a person with less arrogance than I had, they would have remembered. I didn't bring any of these thoughts to Mr. Ungerson's attention. Instead, I asked him what the point of all this was. "Trailblazing," he replied with a cheerfulness that seized at my lungs. "This is about beating the crowds. And yes, Oscar, we've both got eyes in our head, and we know that Cloudberry, that's the restaurant you just ate at, by the way, is absolutely packed. It's adored. It's probably been a cultural institution for this miserable little block of apartments for almost a decade. Like, come on, man. That lady who crafted our meals tonight was old and battered. She looks like airport luggage. Nobody wakes up one morning and cooks meals like that." It hit me then, icy clarity spreading through my brain like menthol on the tongue. I understood his meaning just as he put it out into the garbage-reeking air. "It's about eating at Cloudberry before we do, Oscar. Critics, foodies, bloggers, tourists that walk on their fucking tongues, jackasses in cheap suits chiming in at every water cooler and network break." "Oh shit, bro. You know Watkins Parlor too? My wife and I have our anniversary there every year. I'm so glad you finally found it, bro." Mr. Ungerson ruminated over his own words for a few moments. His face flushed, his hands clasped at his waist. With one hand stroking through his own hair, he continued, his voice calmer. "Oscar, Cloudberry is great. It's a great place. I'm going to have fond memories of that hole for years after tonight. I'm going to tell people stories about this charming little pop-up place on the corner of fuck and who gives a shit. People are going to ask about where they can go get some Cloudberry pho for themselves, for their families." I asked him, hesitantly, if he would be satisfied to be the hypothetical scooper at the watering cooler. Mr. Ungerson stopped, the expression on his face collapsing into this blank nothing. His eyes glanced for a moment to where Mr. Ogata stood. The reek of garbage was high in my nostrils, and I nervously eyed the only exit of the alleyway, still blocked by Mr. Ogata's frame. Then a smile crept across his face, the kind a teacher might give their favorite student. "Oscar, it isn't about that social capital shit. I'm above that stuff. And hey, I give even odds Cloudberry won't even be around much longer. These places, they come and go, you know? Even if they've been in the neighborhood for years, the city always can revoke licenses, or there could be health inspections. And there's health and safety issues, too. Overflowing grease traps, loose propane tubing, fucking tinderbox, man." He mimed fire, blowing his lips out like a child might. My hands shook. I managed to tell Mr. Ungerson that he couldn't do any of this, that it was laughable, that he had the ability to shut down a restaurant.
In reply, he looked at me as if I had accused him of trapping the sun in a box. "Oscar, what are you talking about?" he said, wrinkling his nose. "I'm not doing anything. I just ate at a restaurant. In fact, I just treated you to a fantastic dinner. Relax, it'll be okay. Odds are good that Cloudberry will be here tomorrow. And if you had any issues with me, I don't know what, eating at a place before my coworkers did, then just write one of your blog posts about Cloudberry. Boom! You've foiled my dastardly plan." He clapped me on the shoulder. I told him that I absolutely would write an article about Cloudberry, that it was the best pho I'd ever had, that the manager deserved a chance at the spotlight. Mr. Ungerson scratched at his nose and did not smile. "Okay, buddy, you do that. Are you going to want to lift back home?" I told him that I did not need a lift, though perhaps with significantly more words and candor. He shrugged and walked off, hand raised in farewell above his head. "Later, Oscar. Been an evening, I guess. You stay safe getting home, okay?" As I knelt into the trash to find something to hurl at Mr. Ungerson's gradually diminishing silhouette, Mr. Ogata loomed above me, his hand disappearing into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a cigarette and offered it to me. I declined, and he slid it back into a pristine pack. I don't believe Ogata smoked. "Oscar." His silvered hands smoothed the seam of the meta-aramid fiber jacket he wore. I recognized the jacket's emblem, the serene face of a woman, faultless dynamics, from a rather embarrassing obsession with mil-spec consumer equipment I had in my mid-20s. "You should not write an article about Cloudberry. You should go home, get in the shower, and let this evening run off your shoulders." I did not meet his gaze. Instead, I swallowed and nodded, staring at a graffiti tag of a dead skunk. "I am offering you a courtesy, Oscar," Mr. Ogata said. "Your work is good enough that you've been given awards, yes? Then go do that." And he was gone. Once I was certain of his departure, I left as well, racing for the entrance of Cloudberry. It still stood, just as packed as when we had left. Local clubbers replaced with night shift workers, elbow to elbow with one another. The air smelled of star anise and propane stoves. Without Ogata stiff-arming his way through the crowds, approaching the counter was nearly impossible. But I did it. I secured an interview with Mrs. Kwok Theodore, Cloudberry's head chef. She would see me at closing time, once the customers and money stopped. I accepted what would become a 4-hour and 52-minute wait, just for the chance to speak to her, for a chance at instant satisfaction, to tear down Mr. Ungerson's facade of smug, apathetic gaslighting. So, if you're still with me, you probably want to know how the interview went. What kind of person was this Mrs. Kwok Theodore? What deep and brilliant wisdom could she extract from a hot bowl of pho? Dirty little secret about creative work under a larger publisher. You don't always own the work you create. Well, it isn't really a secret. Most people know about this, even when they sign the contracts. They tell themselves it'll all be worth the hassle once they build enough of a personal brand to set their own terms. Friend, a lot of us don't ever get to that point, the setting terms point. Oscar Yasui, food critic extraordinaire, did not get to that point. Legally speaking, I can't share my interview with Miss Kwok Theodore with any of you, or the article I wrote about Cloudberry afterwards. Full disclosure, it wasn't my best work. I was sleep-deprived when I wrote it, and very angry. And in this raging storm of narcissistic egotism, Mrs. Kwok Theodore didn't deserve that kind of quality. And besides, it never made it past Palladium's editors. I received a very stern lecture on the importance of deadlines from my boss at the time. As for her place, with that cloth curtain depicting a stork plucking a fish from a raging rapid, the city changed its fire codes. Maybe a week after I ate at Cloudberry. I heard a restaurant could escape the fines if they hired a good lawyer, but dozens of places couldn't. Cloudberry couldn't. There's an electronics store where Cloudberry once stood. You can buy keychains of anthropomorphic ramen there. I didn't. but you can if you want.
I've spent a few months thinking about what happened. I've thought about it in the shower, or stargazing on the rail, or when I really should be sleeping. A year by the time I post this episode onto the buffer. Cloudberry was overcrowded, and maybe the fire codes needed to be changed. But then again, Mr. Ungerson might have made good on his plans. I don't believe a man like Mr. Ungerson was speaking purely in the hypothetical. I know very little about him. Wealth can make some aspects of an individual quite public, but others are easily obscured with the right purchases and connections. Did he have that kind of reach? Was he the reason the story never got published? Or was this a case study on pivoting the topic of your article 2 days before deadline? When I started my own writing career, before I began the blog that got Palladium to notice me, I sent out a lot of applications. When you send an application, most of the time it gets filtered into an algorithm, or even a restricted synthetic intelligence if the company is fancy. But on some rare occasions, it might just make its way into the hands of a real person. In any case, if you are rejected, the outcome is the same. Total, overwhelming silence. Silence from all directions, just shouting into a bottle. What went wrong? What went right? If you did something different, would the result change? I never knew if there was a conspiracy against Cloudberry, or against me. Instead, I just had the shadow of its possibility. And it burned a hole in my brain through all the parts of my life I ever cared about. The reputation, the leeway afforded by fame, the easy access to fantastical parties. Remember what I said earlier about how tastes change over the course of our lives? Pho is still, well, it's just an all-around great dish. Come on, it's pho. Who doesn't like pho? But our tastes, our associations, our experiences, it all changes, and not always for the better. One day you have to order something else on the menu. In some cases, you look at the restaurant around you and, well, I made this podcast originally because I had a fear that I wouldn't be able to write as a food critic anymore. But as I worked on it, edited the episodes together, I don't think I can be a food critic anymore. I suppose what I'd like to be now is what you would call a food journalist. I certainly can't turn my back on food after all. I haven't entirely lost my appetite. Cloudberry is gone. You can't eat a bowl of their exquisite pho. But whoever is listening to this podcast, you carry a piece of Cloudberry in your head now. And that has to be worth something, right? It has been, for me. I'm Oscar Yassouie, former licensed food critic for Palladium. Thank you very much for listening to my podcast. Hey folks, I'm Aaron. I'm the guy who writes and edits and voices Gastronaut, working alongside my fiancée and editor Erika, who you'll hear from next episode. If you like the word of Gastronaut or just the sound of my voice, then head on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/Aaron Kling. That's AARONKLING. Over there you can get early releases and the chance to submit questions for our Patreon exclusive mailbag episodes. Also, it keeps me fed and clothed, which is really nice. Anyway, thank you for listening. It really means a lot.